Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are stories that slip through the cracks of history, tales too shameful, too disturbing to be spoken aloud in the daylight. But every so often, one of them surfaces, whispering from old records, broken photographs, or the hushed confessions of a dying town. This is one of those stories. Imagine a man, respected by his neighbors, trusted by his community, feared by his own family. He was the kind of man whose presence silenced a room, whose name carried weight. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. He was the author of his family's darkest chapter. A man who did not simply break society's laws, but rewrote them in his own blood. A man who looked at his own daughter and called her his wife. The shock of that truth is not just in the act itself, but in the silence that followed it. How could a town allow such a thing to take root? How could a family bury a secret so monstrous and still attend church, still smile for photographs, still sit at dinner tables pretending everything was normal? The answer lies in the way power works in small, forgotten places, in the way silence becomes a currency and fear a language. The marriage was not written in headlines. It was hidden in whispers, guarded in attics, and preserved only in the bones of those who could not escape. For decades the story remained buried, spoken of only in fragments, hinted at in warnings passed from one generation to the next. Don't ask questions, don't look too closely. Some truths are better left alone. And yet, here we are, peeling back the layers of a history that was never meant to be uncovered. Tonight, you will hear the story of the most inbred man alive. A father who crossed the unthinkable line, a daughter who became a wife, and a family whose silence is as haunting as the truth itself. What you're about to hear is not folklore. It is not myth. It is the kind of story your grandfather might have heard but refused to repeat. A story that stains bloodlines and leaves entire towns shivering in its shadow. To understand how such a grotesque truth could come to life, we must begin with the man himself. He was not born into darkness, at least not in the way we imagine it. He was born in the hills of rural America, where isolation was not a curse but a condition of life. The roads were few, the neighbors distant, and the whispers of family ties often tangled too closely for comfort. His childhood was marked not by prosperity but by survival, and survival breeds its own kind of law. He grew up learning early that blood was stronger than paper, and family ties outweighed the outside world. In those mountains, in those valleys, outsiders were distrusted, and the family itself became both cage and kingdom. He was taught, like so many in forgotten corners of America, that women were property, that children belonged not to themselves, but to the men who raised them. It was a legacy carried like a sickness, passed from father to son, quietly reinforced by silence. Neighbors may have suspected. They may have noticed the way his daughters were kept close, the way they rarely looked anyone in the eye, the way their laughter, when it came, seemed clipped at the edges. But suspicion was not enough to spark intervention. In those days, and in those places, you didn't interfere in another man's home. What happened behind closed doors stayed there, no matter how unsettling it was. By the time he was a grown man, he had already begun reshaping the family in his own image. His word was final. His daughters did not date, they did not leave without permission, and they lived under a cloud of obedience that suffocated their youth. His control was not loud, it was quiet, suffocating, absolute. And then came the line no one imagined would be crossed. At first it was whispered about in secret, dismissed as rumor, but when the daughter disappeared from public view for months at a time, when she returned with a downcast gaze, and a child soon after, the truth became harder to deny. Neighbors knew but said nothing. Officials looked away. The silence was thick enough to strangle the town. This was no accident of passion, no fleeting moment of madness. This was deliberate. A father who claimed his own daughter as his bride, a child forced into the role of a wife, and a town that turned its head, letting the sickness fester in the shadows. The first child born from this union was not spoken of openly. It was as if the community itself decided to bury the evidence in silence, hoping that by refusing to acknowledge it, the shame would fade. But children are not whispers. They cry, they stumble, they grow, and with every step, they reveal what was meant to stay hidden. The boy carried his father's face, yet his mother's fear lived behind his eyes. He was both son and grandson, a human embodiment of something unspeakable. And though the family rarely brought him into public view, when they did, the whispers grew louder. The townspeople had always turned a blind eye, but even the blind cannot ignore forever what their ears cannot unhear. By the second child, denial was no longer possible. Neighbors began to talk, hushed at first, then in sharper tones. They questioned the lack of school attendance, the strange way the family kept to themselves, and most of all, the mother's role in it all. She was both victim and prisoner, bound not only by her father's power, but also by the crushing weight of secrecy. In a twisted way, the silence of the community chained her just as tightly as the man who ruled her life. The man himself showed no shame. To him, this was not an act of evil, it was a legacy. He justified his actions through warped ideas of bloodlines and loyalty, believing that no outsider could ever be trusted with what was his. To him, the world beyond the valley was corruption, and keeping the family pure was a twisted badge of honor. He believed he was protecting them, when in reality, he was condemning them to a cycle of trauma that would ripple through generations. The children grew in that environment of fear, secrecy, and control. They were taught that their lives began and ended with the family. The outside world was dangerous, the neighbors untrustworthy, and leaving was unthinkable. They were trapped in a prison with invisible bars, built not of steel but of blood, shame, and silence. And yet, even in the most suffocating environments, cracks eventually form. All it takes is one small fracture, one secret too heavy to keep, one child who begins to question. The father believed he could control every breath under his roof, but history has shown that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always claw their way to the surface. The cracks began, as they so often do, with questions. A teacher who noticed the absence of children that should have been in her classroom, a doctor who quietly wondered why certain family members avoided medical visits, a sheriff who had heard rumors for years but dismissed them as nothing more than gossip. One by one, the whispers grew, but they never seemed to reach a place where action was taken. The family name carried weight, and weight bends the law. It was the daughter, the wife, the prisoner, whose silence spoke the loudest. She had no words for what had been done to her. Her face told the story instead, downcast eyes, pale skin, and the tremor of a woman living under permanent shadow. She had been raised to obey, raised to accept her father's authority as the highest law. To the outside world, her passivity looked like complicity, but inside those walls, it was survival. The man used religion, tradition, and fear as his weapons. He convinced his family that outsiders would never understand, that what happened inside the home was sacred, untouchable. To his children, he was not only a father, but a prophet of sorts, declaring that blood ties were stronger than morality, that his choices were divine. It was this twisted belief that kept the house sealed tight, insulated from the world's judgment. But still, suspicion gnawed at the edges of the community. Farmers who passed the family home late at night spoke of strange sounds. Screams quickly silenced, lights that burned until dawn, shadows moving in ways they could not explain. Women in town shook their heads when the family name was spoken, muttering about sins too heavy for God himself to forgive. The truth lived in fragments, scattered across the town like shards of broken glass. Everyone could see the pieces, but no one dared to assemble them. And in this vacuum of silence, the man thrived. He grew older, his control tightening, his grip on the family absolute. The children born of his crime carried the evidence in their very existence, yet no one came to rescue them. No headlines, no investigations, just silence, a silence that weighed as heavy as any chain. The town believed they were protecting themselves by looking away, But history has proven again and again that silence is never protection. It is complicity, and eventually silence breeds monsters that cannot be contained. As the years dragged forward, the family's twisted legacy deepened. The children grew, but they were not free. Their lives were shaped by fear, secrecy, and confusion over who they were supposed to be. Some called their father Dad, others whispered grandfather, but to all of them, he was the same towering figure, judge, jury, and executioner within the walls of their home. The daughter, now far older than her years, bore more children. Each child was another knot in the web of confusion, another living reminder of the cycle that should never have begun. Some of the children bore physical signs of the inbreeding, frailty, features that drew unwanted stares, minds that struggled to keep pace. Yet in that household, these differences were never spoken of. They were simply accepted as God's will, another excuse woven into the man's perverse philosophy. And still, the town did nothing. It was easier to pretend it wasn't happening than to face the horror head-on. Easier to point at other scandals, other sins, than to acknowledge the shadow lurking at the edge of their own streets. The family's home became a kind of ghost house, spoken about but never approached, feared but never confronted. Children dared each other to walk past it at night, but adults crossed the road in daylight, refusing to even glance toward the windows. But every story, no matter how deeply buried, demands to be told. And slowly, the cracks in this family's fortress widened. One of the children, now old enough to question, began speaking to outsiders. Small admissions at first, vague comments that seemed strange but harmless, and yet, when pieced together, they hinted at something grotesque, a truth that, once revealed, would turn stomachs and destroy reputations. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run? Or would silence have swallowed you too? This is the point in the story where horror turns into inevitability. The father believed his reign would never end, that his family would remain locked in his shadow forever. But secrets are like cracks in the foundation of an old house. At first they seem small, insignificant, but over time they widen, and eventually the entire structure collapses. And when this house finally fell, it left behind ruins that could never be rebuilt. The collapse began, not with a dramatic raid or sudden arrest, but with something far smaller, a whisper that reached the wrong ear. One of the children, desperate to be heard, spoke to a teacher who refused to ignore it. Unlike the generations of silence that had come before, this single adult chose to act. She filed a report, and while the authorities hesitated at first, the seed of exposure had been planted. When investigators arrived at the family home, they encountered walls not just of wood and stone, but of fear. The daughter, both wife and victim, said little. Her eyes avoided contact, her voice shook. To those trained to see it, her silence was deafening, and the children. Their stories came in fragments, scattered and broken, but unmistakable in their horror. They spoke of rules that made no sense, of punishments that left scars, of a father whose control extended into every corner of their lives. The community, once so quick to look away, now scrambled to protect itself. Neighbors swore they never knew, though their glances told another story. Officials insisted they had never heard the rumors, though the whispers had lingered in the air for decades. Silence turned to denial, and denial to outrage, but only after the truth had become impossible to bury. The man himself met the investigation with the same cold certainty he had carried all his life. He dismissed accusations as lies, claiming outsiders were trying to destroy his family. To him, the world had always been divided. His blood against theirs, his house against the outside. He truly believed he was untouchable. But history shows us that even the most terrifying men, even those who believe themselves gods in their own homes, eventually fall. And when he fell, the damage left behind was irreparable. The children, scarred by years of abuse and confusion, were thrust into a world they had never known. Omi tried to adapt. Others withdrew into silence, carrying the weight of a childhood stolen. The daughter, stripped of her title as wife, became simply what she had always been, a broken child of a man who had stolen everything from her. The house, once a fortress of secrecy, became a crime scene. Every room, every object seemed soaked in the weight of what had happened there. And as the truth spread beyond the town, the story became something else, a symbol of how silence protects monsters and how entire communities can become complicit in unspeakable crimes. When the dust settled, what remained was not justice, but wreckage. The man was finally stripped of his power, yet his shadow lingered in every corner of the family's lives. The courts could hand down sentences, the newspapers could print their headlines, but no punishment could undo the years of silence, the children born of fear, or the legacy of shame carved into their very blood. The town, too, could not escape its reflection in this story. For years they had looked away, whispering but never acting, and in that hesitation lay their guilt. They had allowed one man's will to become law within his walls. They had believed that secrecy would keep them safe, but secrecy only allowed the horror to grow until it spilled over into the world. In the end, it was not just one man on trial, it was an entire community's silence. The children became adults carrying a weight they never asked to bear. Some tried to disappear, changing names, fleeing far from the valley that had betrayed them. Others found themselves repeating cycles of pain, unable to escape the chains of a past they never chose. And the daughter, the one who was forced to become both wife and mother, remained the most tragic figure of all. She was not only the victim of a father, but of a world that failed to see her cries, failed to save her when she was still young enough to be saved. Stories like this rarely find the light. They linger in the corners of history, whispered about but never written down. They exist in the spaces between truth and denial, between what a community knows and what it refuses to admit. And yet, when they do surface, they force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Monsters are not always strangers. Sometimes they are fathers, grandfathers, brothers, the very people meant to protect. So when we peel back the layers of this story, what we find is not just a family secret, but a mirror, or held up to the darker side of human nature. It is a reminder that silence is never harmless, that shame can become a prison, and that the cost of ignoring the truth is measured in generations lost. This was the story of the man who married his own daughter, the most inbred man alive. A story the world was never meant to hear, buried in the cracks of forgotten history. And yet, here it is, uncovered. A truth that will not go back into the shadows.